Hi, welcome to Heart Change You Live. I'm Ashley. I'm here with Heather and David. We have Matthew in the control room as always. If you have any comments or questions about today's show, please jump in, leave us a comment. Matthew will jump in at a good moment and let us know what you have to say, and we'd love to answer any questions you have. We are here to help you change the lives of those around you. Okay, so today's topic is mental health. We need to talk about mental health.
Yes.
Yes.
So last week, our show was about the unseen realm and just kind of kicking off a series of what happens at the spirit level, you know, and especially, I think it's really important, especially when it comes to mental health, to talk about this because so many of the conventional wisdom and tools for dealing with mental health do happen at the physical and the mental level. You know, it's about changing your thoughts, which is certainly biblical. You know, think on these things, think on good things, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever, all that's definitely biblical and definitely a tool that we can use, but also then the physical level. So it's medication, or make sure you're dieting right, or make sure you're getting enough exercise, which is also biblical. You know, our body is a temple. That's Philippians 4:8. It's the temple of the Lord. But right after that, 1 Corinthians 6:19, But right after that, 1 Corinthians 6:20 says this: "For you were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." Belong to God's. Your body and your spirit are not God's. God's possessive.
You are not God.
They belong to God.
Don't worry, I've got it pulled up on the screen so they can see.
Awesome.
You about took us down a whole different track.
Just want to be clear. We are not that channel. If that's what you're tuning in for, that's not happening here. But, you know, that has been something that is the core of what we do here in Heart Change. We use the term heart change a lot, but what we talk about is what's happening at the spirit level. So I just thought it was a really perfect tie-in that we had this question in the comment section of our YouTube video last time on the unseen realm. And Matthew did a great job answering it in the comments. Thank you, Matthew, for doing that. But I also think it's a question that a lot of people have. So as we were discussing hearing voices during that unseen realm, someone asked, why would God give us this gift? What purpose could it possibly serve? Because especially at a mental health level, that is one of the more, to use your word, grotesque, or one of the more extreme examples that we think of. Someone who has schizophrenia, who hears voices, or someone who has dissociative identity disorder, what used to be called multiple personality disorder. Why would God do that? Why would he give that gift? And the understanding starts at the spirit level. So for people who are watching, I want to encourage anybody who has questions to look at a video that Pastor did this past summer during your deep dive. The video was called, "Where is My Spirit and Why Should I Care?" So it's in the same playlist of HCU Live where you go into the spirit and why we should care about it and make it practical. But I think if people want to understand where we're coming from, that's a great place to start. But I don't think it precludes us having this conversation about why the heck would God? Why would God give us that, knowing it can be manipulated, knowing that it can be, that it can take us down these paths that can be destructive and painful?
Well, you're throwing me a curve.
Of course I am.
Let's just start with the word potential. Any potential can be abused. And God created us in his image. When we're created in his image, and that has a spiritual piece, it has a mental, emotional piece, it has a body piece, all of that can be taken advantage of by the demonic realm or by evil. So my potential, God creates that, is capable of being used for good, for evil. To me, I guess I don't even think in the terms that you brought up of why would God? I think back to, well, he created potential and we get to choose how that potential is used.
Right, because if we look at the Old Testament, which Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, forever, there have always been people who were able to hear the voice of God. There have also always been people who have been able to be manipulated, starting at the garden, in perfection, in paradise, are able to be manipulated by Satan in the demonic realm, by hearing voices, by seeing visions. Lots of prophets that, false prophets who were taken advantage of by false gods and gave false prophecies and all types of things throughout the Old Testament. But who I was really thinking about around this was someone we talked about last time, actually, which was King Saul. And King Saul had a tormenting spirit that would come over him.
And if you really want to make it, a tormenting spirit from God.
From God, right. So, as I look at that and I think about King Saul, and Saul, Paul, also shared that he had a messenger from Satan, a thorn in his side, which we don't really know how that manifested. There's different theories on that. But in both instances, they're both named Saul. They both have these messengers of Satan attached to them because of pride. In both instances, it shows up maybe in different ways. I pray. I mean, I don't have any stories about Paul putting anybody up with a spear or getting paranoid that they were trying to take over or any of those poor things that happened to King Saul. So it would appear to me that this has been by design. This is the potential. This is.
It's potential. Ashley, you didn't like it when I threw in the from God there?
That's just that is just one of those things that's really hard for people to wrap their heads around. I'm like, and of course we throw that out there, Well, because that really is because you think of God being rainbows and sunshine.
Many times people are there, they're like, you can't attribute that to God, etc. But that language pretty bold and pretty straightforward.
It's there in black and white right there.
You kind of have to deal with it as it is. You either try to explain it away at that point or you put it in there and you deal with it.
And wrestle with it.
I actually want to go completely different, what's new? I always jump clear outside of the field, but let's just go to mental illness for a little bit. Isn't it interesting that the term that we choose in this culture is mental illness?
Right, it's in the mind.
It doesn't matter if it's emotional health. It doesn't matter if been dealing with some of these kinds of situations where pretty sure the serotonin levels were extremely low, and so the capacity to think was completely burnt and fried at that point. So, of course, we would call it mental health because the body has created a thinking issue, but it's not mental health. It really is physical. It is brain health. It's the physical side of it. It's not the thinking side. And then you get into voices. Well, all of a sudden, what I would at least classify as, okay, there's spiritual interaction going on here, some demonic influence. We call that mental health. And part of the problem goes back to science. In science today, there is not room for a human spirit. None. So if I'm going to teach psychology in a secular university, I have to try to create body-based. And frankly, if you're going to do that, how do you even go mind-based?
Well, they tried going physical-based, and so they did things like lobotomies, electroshock therapy, hydrotherapy, all sorts of drugs, that type of thing, and that didn't work. So now we need to look at the mental side, and let's get them thinking differently. Let's think about neurological, which is also physical, but thinking. Now we're getting into like the power of positive thinking kind of thing, which a lot of the self-help movement is all about. If we can just get people to feel better about themselves and have better self-esteem, they won't have these issues anymore.
So we try to make it mind-based, and so science is trying to deal with something. If they have a hard time dealing with thoughts, and of course now we've got all of these pictures of the brain and the electrical activity and et cetera, so it's like, oh, okay, we feel better now. It's a science now. But if you're having trouble with thoughts and mental illness, what do I do with spirit and spiritual stuff in a science-based world? It's just like there's not any capacity to make that leap. And so what we've done as a culture, we've taken it all and we've pressed it into the world of the mind. And then everything becomes education, everything becomes change your thoughts, and we don't even allow for this other kinds of stuff. And that's why the voices to me is so important. if we have spiritual capability to hear the voice of God, I'm going to suggest to you, potential, we also have the ability to hear the voice of Satan and demonic realm and demons and etc. So if I'm actually taking voices that I am hearing, and we're talking about a spiritual zone, last time we talked about this in the program, I think there's things that do come out of your own imagination. So I'm not eliminating that as a possibility. Sure. But if there is very real spiritual activity, and we define it as mental illness, I believe we've done a disservice to the people who are struggling at that point.
This really feels like a earth is flat theology, or like, mental state. I was reading this book, and it was, it's a good book. It's one of my favorites. But in there, it kind of personifies Christopher Columbus, and the character gets to interact with Christopher Columbus and learn from him. And he, in that book, the character Christopher Columbus says, truth is truth, even if nobody believes it. And I don't know, that has always just kind of stuck with me. Like, people don't have to believe it for it to be there and to be true. And the fact that there is a spiritual side to mental health is a truth.
And where I went 30, 40 years ago was I stepped back, I studied spirit, heart, soul, mind, all of these terms at a deeper level, and stepped back and said, wow, the model that we're using, even in Christian counseling, even in Christian psychiatry, the model we're using is not a biblical model, because it basically negates, doesn't take a look at, doesn't even consider the role of the spirit. And it's interesting when you study Christian psychology and et cetera, it's like they'll come right up to the line, and they'll be acknowledging different kinds of capabilities we have as human beings that really are kind of over here in the spiritual zone. And then we hit a certain point, and it's just like, oh, but I have to come back under the science. And so over and over again, I've read these books, and it's just maddened me, because it's like they come right up against a biblical description that would work. And then it's like, oh, but wait a minute, we have to pull all this back into a psychological language which basically negates the human spirit and the role of the human spirit in mental health.
So I have a question for you then. How do you determine what's possibly at a physical level, actually like the brain not functioning, serotonin or whatever, versus a spiritual level? How do you make the distinction?
Pray.
Yay!
There really isn't a good answer to that. I mean, obviously, if I do believe I can hear the voice of God, I hope that I will be led by God. And so that wasn't meant to be just a flippant answer. In my world, my belief system says I can be led by God. I can hear the voice of
Amen.
God. So that was not just a flippant answer, even though it came across that way.
Well, we've turned it into that, where, well, all you can do is pray. Like, I've exhausted every other one of my human efforts, and now I guess I'm just going to have to rely on the only one who can do everything.
And we've got a YouTube question kind of mirroring that a little bit, mirroring. And Plain Jane is asking, practically speaking, what do you do then if you need help or know someone that does need help, but even the Christian model is more worldly than not?
Well, I'm going to go back to Ashley's question. Hopefully it'll kind of bleed over a little bit. When she said, how do you know the difference? There is experience over a period of time. In other words, there are things that happening at the body level where you're just evaluating this thing, and the brain's in a brain fog. And we see this with addiction all the time, where a person who's been on meth, they've been in alcohol, whatever it is, we know that there's going to be a brain fog for a particular period of time. So just chill out, slow it down, get them to sleep, take a few breaths, etc. There are kinds of things that are predictably physical that are going to impact the brain. Having been around it, you can somewhat look at it, predict it, know that this is a normal outcome, and so you start with that. I mean, you start with what you know, and you work from there. And a lot of times when I'm working with these kind of things, it's a step-by-step process of elimination. Now, hopefully, sure, pray. And there's times when I'm working with someone that you kind of get a sense, a nudge of the Holy Spirit, and you start down a direction. You happen to be right on the right path, and you know you're on the right path because it's connecting. I mean, it's hitting, it's working, it's making a difference. It's like, okay, we're in the right place. But there are things that are clearly physical that you work with. There are things that are mental. You know, they're verbal strongholds. They're that sort of thing. There's things that are more emotional, but there's things that are more spiritually driven. And that's the piece that I just don't see and understanding in so much of what's going on. And the voices is an easy one to start with, because the voices, it's like, if it really is genuinely voices, and it is split personality, it is some of those different things, wait a minute, the most likely thing is spiritual. Could that be produced out of the imagination? It could be. But I'm going to start with the most likely thing is a spiritual base. So let's start working with it from that point of view first.
So are there things that, we're kind of talking like hearing voices, and like these are all, in my opinion, the like super obvious ones. Mm-hmm. But are there ones that are not so obvious? Something like anger or I don't know, self-hatred. I mean, like the less obvious stuff that have a spiritual holding or a spiritual basis. I mean,
I go back to what I teach over and over again. I believe your mind reacts inside of your spirit. Now, because our culture, including our Christian culture, teaches a mind-centered worldview. All right, stop, go back 2,000 years. 2,000 years ago, there was a spirit-centered worldview, i.e. the Hebrew worldview. There was a mind-centered worldview, i.e. the Greek worldview. And so what's interesting, you had the exact same two things going on 2,000 years ago when Jesus was walking the earth. Jesus validated a spirit-centered worldview. So once I began to understand, okay, there's a spirit-centered worldview, what I believe is your mind functions inside of what's going on spiritually. So if I have a person who is as bitter can be, and that is at a high intensity level, what's that going to do to their mental function? It's going to absolutely keep their thoughts gathered together in a small circle with a high emotional intensity that you can sit down and try to talk to them until you're blue, and you are not going to argue that person out of their bitterness. It's not going to happen because the spiritual side supersedes, overshadows, covers, dominates the mental side, and we have tried to approach it the other direction. We've said, oh, okay, well, you're struggling with this kind of stuff, and then we've made bitterness purely an emotion. We haven't let it be spiritual. So we've made bitterness purely an emotion, and so here, let me just kind of pet you for a little bit and see if I can get your emotions in a better place. You know, I mean, we haven't understood the spiritual dynamic and the power that it actually holds.
So your answer was yes.
I kind of lost the question, so I guess if you say my answer was yes, I think we'll go with that.
We also had somebody chiming in on Facebook. Kimberly was saying when they were going through that, they realized through the Holy Spirit that they were of a divided mind. They thought it was a split personality, but the Holy Spirit revealed that they just had a divided mind that needed to be worked out in the Lord.
That's
and
cool.
Let me talk about that because in James it talks about a double-minded, and I'm going to go there. Let's say it really was a, quote, double-mindedness. Double-mindedness, everybody has different core values, and part of what I believe about your human spirit, it's the house of your deepest core desires, your deepest passions. So a lot of people have, sometimes I teach it in terms of spiritual gifts, they have two different core values deeply within them. And let's say they're a 50-50. Well, if you're a 50-50 in this spiritual part, where you have two different sets of core values, and you come up against an issue that's kind of a 50-50 issue, and you don't have the voice of God to help clear it up, you're not submitted, surrendered to the Word of God to help you clear it up, I hit this 50-50 and I'm in a double-minded place. I don't know which way to go. I'm not looking to something outside of myself, and I'm halting between two opinions. I'm just kind of sit there, just 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and I'm just kind of there. And so then I ended up in a place of double-mindedness. So even terms like double-mindedness, when you pull it back into a spiritual worldview, takes on a whole different context than the way we normally think about double-mindedness.
So, okay, when you're talking about that and you're in a zone where you have these two values that can sometimes clash against each other. So in a healthy zone, for me, I don't know. If I'm that person, then a healthy zone would look like me allowing God to say, okay, this one needs to stand up and this one needs to sit down. And then in a little bit, God would say, this one needs to stand up now. Like a stand up, sit down.
You've been around me long enough.
I know, I'm picking up some of your words.
And so, yes, when you have two different core desires, and frankly, this is a spiritual gifts model, you have all of these different core values. The model that I teach has 7 different core values. You have at one point the administrator needs to stand up. That's the value we need right now. That needs to be practically applied. But you don't let the administrator rule everything forever. Okay, administrator, sit down, and now mercy, stand up. The same thing happens within us as individuals. We have all these different core values. But that deeply seated value is inside of you. If you don't have the context of the body of Christ, if you don't have the context of the Word of God, you don't have all of these, the voice of God, at some point, I choose one or the other and I allow one to dominate the other. When I do that, then I'm going to develop a self-hatred inside of myself where one is running over the other. And now I will have, quote unquote, mental illness. I'm using today's terminology. I will have mental illness just because one part of me is getting run over and the other one is given free rein.
We've got 2 questions coming in on YouTube. The first question is from Keith, and Keith wants to know, can people find healing without a biblical worldview? So can they be healed if they don't have a biblical worldview?
Depends on your problem.
I'm actually going to come back as truth is truth, wherever you find it. And you actually mentioned that a little bit before. You can draw light. I call it reflected light. You can get light. You can get life from people. You can get life from a lot of different places. So on the one hand, I'm going to say, yes, you can get healing.
There is a
outside of
common
that.
grace.
Yeah, there is a common grace where I'm not directly praying, I'm not directly receiving from God, but yet, wow, some good stuff is happening in me, and you look around. I think it's generally out there. Every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father, James chapter 1. So it's out there, it's available. Just because I don't know it's from God or don't acknowledge it that it's from God doesn't mean it wasn't routed to me from God.
But I'm going to jump in and say that, while a non-biblical source of help, even if it's true, it can help you get better. But there's going to be a vast difference from God's level of healing and a worldly level of healing. God can make you whole where the world can cover or help you limp by. It's like, it's like the world, like they'll heal your leg enough to where you could maybe walk, but God can actually restore your leg. I don't know. I don't even know if you have a leg problem. That was just an example.
Even a blind squirrel finds a nut occasionally. Frankly, think about it. If you're in a non-biblical worldview connecting with stuff that's mixed up, messed up, and you stumble upon a solution, well, you stumbled on a solution. You're probably going to think about that solution from a wrong perspective, and you're going to hope that your blind squirrel can find the next nut. You're just out there poking around. That's why a right model, a Christian model that includes the human spirit, is huge.
Can I just say I love you guys, that this is your answer to this. It makes me so happy because not everyone, even Christians, would have responded to this question this way. So what a blessing that I'm sitting here with you two. So thank you for your integrity and standing on the word.
So explain this way to me.
Well, so I'm thinking about his question because I have searched. I was a complete atheist, secular humanist, started having issues now, I believe, related to trauma from childhood, started having difficulty with alcoholism, searched out a mental, solution to it through counseling, through understanding, more of like a, not necessarily as Freudian, but Jungian. So I started bringing in more less tangible ideas like Carl Jung did, but it was a house built on sand. Mm-hmm. So it was like I'd overcome one thing and, okay. So now I'm sober. So I was able to stay sober for a period of time, but I was still having these problems with my personal relationships and seeing these same patterns happening over and over and over again. I'm not drinking. I've been relieved of that. But what about this? And then when my health started to fail, well, I didn't have an answer for that. So then I started to look to more like holistic models. And so I became a body-mind nutrition coach and started changing the way that I ate and eating whole foods and doing elimination diets. And and for a moment, all of them would work. But what happened for me, praise be to God, I got to a place where none of those were sufficient to overcome the spiritual crisis that I found myself in 5 years ago. And none of them would last for everything. Standing on the rock of Christ for these last several years, I can say that the Word of God has an answer for every single problem I have. And I've been thinking about that recently, how I always heard people say there's no instruction book for life, or you hear your parents, you didn't come with an instruction manual, but we do. We don't like it because it's ego deflating and sometimes it's hard to understand and, all of these kind of things. But I'm very thankful that we can say, sure, it'll work. Try it. Because you really do. I had to try all of them before I was willing to say God alone.
See, Heather, I would have gone the way that you were expecting, which my answer to the question that Keith asked of, can people find healing? My answer is no. They can find imitation healing, but true healing only comes through the Word and through God. So while it might help things, it's not actually healing.
Right.
And so my answer would be absolutely not. But that doesn't mean that there aren't techniques and things like that can make your life better in the moment, but they're not actually going to solve anything. But that's just me.
Well, I think it's semantics, so I don't know that I'm totally disagreeing with you. But if it's a body issue, if you've got a right model and it's a body issue and your serotonin level's down or whatever the body issue is, then you might want to do something to address that particular piece. And you can pray all day long for a miracle and you may or may not get one. I'm not saying that you won't get one. But if it's a body issue, you address it at the body issue. If it's a stronghold in your thinking, you address the stronghold in your thinking. If it's an emotional piece, you work towards a traditional counseling technique where you get, emotional release. Now, back to what you said. If you're working completely from those dynamics, you are going to get a temporary result. So then back to what Matthew's saying, no, doesn't work. I get that. The complete healing comes back to us being who we are in Christ, which I believe the top of the point, the starting point, is communing with God, God's Spirit communing with our spirit, filling us up with peace, filling us up with joy, which does what? It does a truckload of good in the area of anxiety, which is one of the major causes of all of these kinds of problems. So I get the peace of God on board at the spiritual level. I begin to discover those core desires. I begin to discover who I am. I start working out a purpose. Well, if I've got my purpose piece in place, I've got my passion piece where it is. I've got my presence piece where it should be. If that's all happening at the spirit level, it's much easier to begin to address thoughts, to address emotions, to get the body in place. So on the one hand, I sort of agree with you that, yeah, you got to have this thing in order and it's got to start with Christ. But on the other hand, I can have my spirit stuff in order and I've got a body issue and wow, you need to do some sleeping or whatever.
I'm thinking about that old Doc, it hurts when I do this, and he's like, well, just quit doing that. Oh, okay. So there is a degree of that. If I'm just laying around watching TV all day long, then my body's not going to work as well as it could if I were exercising every day. But let's say I get an exercise regimen. Well, then I may want to be looking into, why was I laying around watching TV all day long to begin with? You know, like what was I hiding from?
Okay, Matthew, do we have a second question?
Yeah, we had another question. It seems to be a pretty popular topic. This one was posted a little while back, and the viewer wants to know, how do you address medicines that are prescribed for the mental illnesses that may stem from being spiritual? What do you see the Bible saying about this?
I'm going to ask a question back and see if you read into it. What does it mean, them being spiritual, or whatever that last part of that was? I'm not sure I understood that.
Well, we've been talking about all the spiritual issues. They said, how do you address the medicines prescribed for the mental illnesses that stems from the spiritual? What do you see the Bible saying about this?
Well, I'm going to go back to an integrated model. You know, there are medicines that actually shut down the entire being. But a lot of times people are hearing voices, and so they don't do a spiritual solution, but they prescribe medicines that take a person into almost a comatose state. And in that comatose state, then, wow, the voices just quit. Well, yeah, but now I have to put up with all of the other physical implications. So medicines have a particular impact. Are there times when, just like sleep, let's go to that one. Sometimes the most spiritual thing a person can do when they're coming in the program, having been on a binge or something, most spiritual thing I can do is get them just sleep for a while. Just sleep for a while. Sometimes the people aren't able to sleep. Maybe a sleeping pill of some sort helps them get into that first sleep zone. So I'm able to use something medicine-wise to bridge that gap to get me going in terms of that.
Yep.
I always talk about, with medicines, I'm a minimalist. You know what? Let's use as little as we can, because there's almost always contraindications that they're creating different impacts that I don't want to have. So let's do as little as we can to get as much as we can because of the side effects and all the different stuff that we are. But there are times when modern medicine has a place and a purpose where it's actually very helpful.
Absolutely. It can be a stabilizing feature, you know, to just get someone calm enough. I think, in my experience, both clinically and personally, it depends on what I do while I'm on the medication. You know, so just like we're not making medicine into an idol, in other words, as a cure-all. If I take the medication, for example, let's just go at a physical model, but I'm using it to show a point with psychological as well. If I start taking a high blood pressure medication, but there's some dietary measures that can be taken. So if I start taking a high blood pressure medication and don't change my diet, the chances are I'm going to get some effect from the blood pressure medication. But what if I also changed my diet? Does that make sense? So what am I doing while I'm taking it? So if while I'm taking an antidepressant, for example, it gets me stable to a point where I'm able to start praying, where I'm able to start reaching out for help, doing some counseling, seeing things a little more clearly, going for exercise, doing other things that will help me physically and mentally and spiritually, then the medication has done its job, I think. It's worked as kind of training wheels, so that when those come off, I've got a baseline, which is what we try to do in the program, try to get people to have a baseline for taking the training wheels off, so that when those supports are removed, your bike doesn't fall down and you feel more comfortable and confident.
To me, what's important is to have a model of spirit, soul, and body, and to understand, I think these things are coming out of the body. I think these things are in that soulish realm, the mind, will, and emotions. I think these things are in the spirit area. And you address spiritual stuff with spiritual. You address the conscious realm with really teaching and sharing and different kinds of things that really work with that. And you address body stuff at a body level, which may be exercise, it may be sleep, it could be at different points. There might be a medication that's going to be helpful. I don't think you just come and just write all of that off. And that's what people tend to do. They tend to do an either or. They're looking for a home run. And what I find is, back to what we actually talked about earlier, many times one intervention will be helpful for a little bit.
Right.
And then after that season passes, well, people get out the big hammer and try to hit that same thing harder and harder and harder, when no, it's time to change. Just because that was helpful for a little while doesn't mean it'll continue to be helpful, because now that we've dealt with this area, we've unmasked this new area. So let's begin to deal with the new area now.
I've enjoyed these questions.
Well,
I
good.
love the questions. I've been so excited to hear them. So, I don't know.
Well, this whole area is difficult because so much of the time, I'll get myself in trouble, but it really isn't scientific. We've done the studies to try to make it scientific, to try to get it to sound scientific, but you're dealing with thoughts, you're dealing with emotions, you're dealing with spiritual stuff. I would argue that at the body level, we can do chemical testing and we can be closer to being scientific at the body level. And they've tried to do that with thoughts through the electrical pictures and the activity and et cetera. But when you come down to it, it's really not as scientific as we would like to make it. And so then we're guessing, and we're guessing in ways that, back to my hobby horse, that eliminates the spirit of man, when I believe that the spirit is the absolute biggest driver, and learning how to work with that is just, it's huge.
Well, isn't it the first cause? So, like, if we were talking about, I'm just thinking about how now medicine is moving into the genome. Mm-hmm. And moving into, like, even vaccinations now are going into the DNA level. So they're getting sort of closer, because it's like, oh, there's something invisible that starts at conception that may, so they're kind of getting in a spiritual, in a physical, mental, or a physical medical worldview, they're getting a little bit closer to the truth, mm-hmm. which is, no, you're right. It does start at conception. It does start because God gives us a spirit at the very beginning, and then he forms our body around that. And from that, we have nature, nurture, experiences, which is what we use psychology to deal with. So I feel like maybe medicine, without realizing it, is getting a little bit closer to the truth in terms of first cause, that we need to go to that. But if you can just get there to begin with, and if you can just start there, that's what that model does. Man, it can save you a lot of time playing whack-a-mole. Mm-hmm. If you can just go to the back of the machine and unplug it, that was the problem. The problem.
Psychological whack-a-mole.
It
boom,
is.
Boom, boom.
And physical. I mean, because and medicine is now backing this up, that our physical body is impacted by our mental well-being, right? Like, so many diseases now, they're understanding, oh, that's a stress thing. Mm-hmm. That it's coming from stress, heart problems, migraines, chronic pain, or trauma. They're even going beyond that. So it's kind of cool, because this body-mind model, they're getting a little bit closer. It's like, oh, maybe they're reacting to a trauma thing. And what you would say is, yes, the trauma is being stored at the spirit level, mm-hmm. because that is, to use your word, which I really love, is you use it as a filter. Mm-hmm. And in that video that you did, the what is my spirit and why should I care, the analogy that you used that made so much sense to me is that it's a filter. So everything that we receive and everything we give from the moment of conception, of God creating our little spirit in a physical form, everything is being recorded through that filter. And over time, the filter gets clogged, but everything has to pass through it, whether it's coming in or going out. So that includes the trauma, that includes the physical pain, and that includes the psychological, mental health that comes, or illness that comes as a result of it.
Proverbs 20:27, the spirit of a man is the lamp of the Lord. Notice the use of the language here. The spirit of a man is the lamp of the Lord, searching all the inner depths of his heart. Now, I'm going to go to probably one of the most prominent words in religious circles today, the presence of God. The presence of God interacts with our spirit, not your mind, not your emotions. Does it overflow from your spirit to your mind and your emotions? Absolutely. Does it have an impact? Absolutely. But there is a thing in the Bible of spirit. There is a something called spirit. And I believe the three key words that I used already: purpose, I already used passion, but presence. You have at any moment, you have a snapshot of presence. And it's amazing with this model. I can walk up to people and literally within seconds begin to discern what kind of spiritual presence is going on in a person. Within seconds, you already know a lot of that. And here's what the verse says: the spirit of the man is the lamp of the Lord. The spirit of the man. The spirit of the man is the lamp of the Lord. You walk up and you can discern a person's spirit. Now, are sometimes people good at playing the cover and doing all of this show and etc.? So we're not God. We can't see all the layers, but many times
you can tell when something's wrong.
Many times you can see, all right, I'm seeing something. Now notice the language in that: searching all the inner depths of his heart. Most of the time, heart is a more inclusive word that is including both spirit, soul, which would be mind and emotions. So the spirit man, when we start to see the spirit man, now I start inquiring in order to see the heart, which is the bigger picture, which is the whole picture. So I'm dealing with mental illness. Oh, wait a minute. No, I'm not dealing with mental illness. That's a modern construct that puts the mind at the center of the person's being. And really, it comes back to, no, the spirit is at the center of the person's being. And if you move your target just a few inches, so to speak, from mind to spirit, you actually have a more accurate tool to work with when you're working with people.
I'm really glad you brought this up, because it could be, because we've been talking about the spirit realm for the last 2 weeks, it could be interpreted that, oh, you're saying mental illness is demons.
No.
But
absolutely
that's not what we're saying. It can be amplified by the demonic realm or by unseen spiritual forces, but you're really talking about the individual person's filter, spirit, through everything that's coming and going. So if I've got a clogged filter, some things might come out clogged. It could come out as depression, come out anxiety. Is that what?
It's like wearing green glasses. If you wear green glasses, you're going to see everything green.
Right.
Well, let's go back to mental illness. If I'm hearing voices and I'm interacting with those voices, I think it's a reasonable call to call that mental illness. I don't have an argument with that, but the source of it isn't the mind. See, that's a big difference. It's not just whether or not it's mental illness. I had a relative who basically played the hypocrite, so to speak, was the most bitter person I had ever met in my life. But this person, because she went to church and was religious, she wasn't bitter. And if you tried to tell her that she was bitter, she would literally bite your head off. Well, that to me, that's like a form of mental illness. I mean, it's absolute denial of reality. I would call that mental illness. But again, I don't know that I would say the source of that mental illness was the mind. See, that's two different things. You can describe something as mental illness, and you can kind of be correct that, wow, your thinking and your ability to think are really messed up. But that's what's different when you're in a mind-centered worldview. They believe the solution is working with the mind and working with the thought life. I don't. The vast majority of the time, the mind and the thought life, if you take care of the other pieces around it, the vast majority of the time, the thought life will come back into a healthy state almost without addressing it.
So when we don't know what the spirit is or how it even gets in the state that it gets in, it's no wonder that we try to leap to things like medicine or talk therapy or, mind and body. So what is the spirit and why do I care is a good introduction. But in a nutshell, can you explain to me, how does one's spirit get sick?
Well, let's just start with, I believe your spirit, first of all, it has kind of an eternal capacity. So let's just start there. Your spirit is God-breathed. Bible is very clear. When your spirit is there, you are living. When your spirit is gone, you're dead. It's really that simple. So if the spirit is God breathed and we have a human spirit, then my next question is, what does that spirit do? And again, I'm back to those three things. It does those things. Now, I believe there is a spiritual recorder that is on. And this, to me, I believe is proven by the fact that you have traumas that happen in the womb that are absolutely pre-memory or first year of life or birth itself or et cetera, that as far as brain formation is concerned, and even if you don't buy brain formation, let's do language. As far as language is concerned, your ability to remember them in a normal sense is not quantifiable. I mean, it's just not there. So if that's true, why is that stuff still impacting people? And I believe that your deeper piece is that spiritual piece. And let's just go back to presence, because that's a good description. If you have trauma during while you're in the womb, that trauma is going to interact with your spirit, and it's going to create a normal of trauma. So then when you come out of the womb, you're operating from a spiritual location of trauma, and I haven't even interacted with my first human being outside of the womb yet. And so then as time goes on, generally, if you had trauma in the womb, you're probably going to have trauma after you get out of the womb. There's going to be this entire mess. Well, fast forward 10 years, my spirit is like locked up. When your spirit is locked up and you're a 12-year-old trying to interact with other 12-year-olds, guess what? Guess what normal social relationships are going to look like? You're going to think inside of that. You're going to feel inside of that. You have an absolute filter over your brain that it is virtually impossible for you to jump outside of that filter and begin to think normally. And so what people do, they'll set them down and say, okay, we're going to do counseling. Now, don't you know that the way you're thinking is unreasonable? And a lot of times at some point you talk them into the fact that, okay, yes, I know my thinking is unreasonable. So we wake up the next day, I tell myself it's unreasonable, and guess what? I'm back into the same trauma. It isn't, that mental discussion doesn't have the power to break that person free.
Okay, so the spiritual illness is due to a trauma, could be due to a trauma.
Trauma's an easy target to
that
start
happened in early pre-memory. So, which I definitely biblical, but it could also be a good thing. I mean, like I'm thinking of Jacob and Esau, of course, warring in the womb, and that spirit came to fruition in their lives. But we also have John the Baptist, who recognized Jesus in the womb and leapt for joy inside of his mother's belly. So there can be a positive spiritual experience as well that happens to the, am I right?
Absolutely.
Gestationally?
During your early days, you are laying down a normal function. So if I'm in a joyful atmosphere, my spirit is literally taking that on. What flows through you sticks to you, and you're like, well, there's not much flow through at that point. But I'm there in the womb. I'm actually experiencing. Now, I'm going to stop there. You take the pictures of babies in the womb. They feel, they move, they smile, they have expressions. So they may not be saying it to another person, but there is a flow through sort of a thing going on. So absolutely, if I'm in the womb and I'm interacting with that positive stuff, I come out of the womb, there's a peace about that child. There's just a different dynamic that's been laid down in that child. Again, we don't think about any of this stuff. We use solely the tool of the mental realm and counseling to try to address things that are so much deeper. We don't even look at any of these other things.
Don't you think that it's probably because of our human ego, though, because we want to be able to do something about it? Like, if I got screwed up in the womb, what am I going to do about that? You know what I mean? The only people that really go back that far, at least in my experience, are people who get into new age stuff like rebirthing and reincarnation, and we're going to go back into past life regression and all that kind of stuff because there's something that happened to your soul spirit before you came here. So there are people who are addressing that, but you're absolutely right. I don't hear that happening in a psychological model and not in a Christian model either. That is something unique to the ministry here, to this way of thinking. But don't you think that it's because of our ego? We want to be able to fix it. We want to be able to do something. And
I don't think it's even that. I just think it doesn't occur to us.
Okay.
I just think it doesn't even cross our minds. And honestly, I didn't even think it was a thing until I heard Pastor talking about it, until I heard David talking about it. And I was like, what? And I was like, okay. But it's like, I know him and I trust him enough. I'm like, okay, well, it must be a thing.
It's totally a thing.
Know?
Taken from a girl who got regressed to birth.
And then when you sit in my seat and you start working with people, and what is a thing in psychology is developmental psychology. Mm-hmm. So there are certain development phases that fit with certain ages. And I start seeing 3-year-old behavior. And so I look at the person and say, what happened when you're 3? And it's virtually 100%. They're able to tell me what the trauma was at that particular age point. Oh, wow. There's something to this thing. Trauma was introduced here. Arrested development came, and out of that arrested development, I've got a 35-year-old doing 3-year-old behavior. So all of these things, I mean, they're all attested to by science and by the worldview, but we don't have the tool of the human spirit to work with. So then we call it mental illness, and the only tool that we really have is counseling. You go to drugs, you go to therapy, which is, okay, I'm hopefully we're going to get you to talk about it, and if you bleed it off. Well, that works if are you ready? Fancy language. If you're an external verbal processor. In other words, if when you talk out loud about it to somebody else, you bleed it off, well, then you actually bleed it off. But there are people who aren't external verbal processors, they're rehearsers. So every time they talk about it, it actually gets lodged deeper within them, and they become more angry, more bitter. So we propose therapy for all of these people, and there are people who literally come out of therapy worse off than they went into it because of who they are and how they function. And we have this one-size-fits-all inside of a worldview that doesn't allow for a human spirit. If there's one thing that I hope that people are getting here, once you start understanding there's a human spirit and it is incredibly powerful, it is more impactful than anything mental, it is more impactful than anything spiritual, and basically across the board, almost nobody's talking about the human spirit and the impact that it has on our person.
Mm-hmm. I was just sitting here thinking about like my own experiences, and and it's not, this can happen even with things that are smaller than a trauma, because one of the things I struggle with is feeling like I don't deserve receiving help. Like when my back's against the wall, I believe that the people who I reach out to will not respond and help me. And I've seen it. Like I feel like that's come true. And I was talking to my mom about this, and she told me of this instance while she was, pregnant with me, where this exact thing happened. And I was like, okay, that's a little creepy. That's a little woohooey for me. But I don't know, it's fascinating to me that it's not only these deep, heavy things. It's things that are smaller that people can struggle with too. Like it's a concept for big and small things.
Absolutely.
Truth is truth.
And I feel like I have to put one other disclaimer in there. It's not what happens to you. It's how what happens to you interacts with those deep core values.
With your
like
passion,
how you
your
respond,
presence,
with your,
and your purpose.
Exactly, because something that would, and let's get out of the womb. Let's go fast forward. What hurts you today is what you care about. You can only be hurt by what you care about. So even in the womb, you already have that what you care about. If there's things going on in the womb that are just reaching into that thing that you care about, it's going to impact you in the womb. It's going to impact you at age 2. It's going to impact you at age 7. It doesn't matter what it was. So there's a dynamic here. And again, I believe that's part of your spirit, that deep core value / purpose piece is a part of your spirit. So when I'm seeing a person's spirit, when I'm seeing their purpose point, and then I'm seeing those get violated in real time, we got a problem here. I can have the person standing right beside them can be violated in exactly the same way, but it's not a big deal to their purpose. It's not a big deal to their passion. Nothing happens. So it's not like what happens to you in the womb just absolutely determines your life. That's not the way it works. It's what happens to you in the womb interacting with who you are, because you're God-breathed, and that's already there from the very beginning.
Okay, now you got me thinking.
Well, let's just go to you. Let's go to what you
that's
just
what
talked
I'm like,
about.
no, wait a minute here.
Yeah.
You have a leadership calling.
Okay.
You like to be heard.
Yes.
You like to be listened to.
Uh-huh. I get very angry when I feel ignored.
Exactly. So guess what? This is right down that alley of, oh, wow, I'm not being heard. I don't deserve. See, it absolutely lines up with your core passion. So even one incident at that point has the potential to kind of reach in there and poke you in a way that it's painful and create a kind of a sore spot in there that is very likely to be poked again in later life. Oh, just got poked again. Oh, it just got poked again.
And see, this is, okay. And that's the thing that frustrates me the most, because in my head, I am like, why does this bother me so much? Like, why? Like, I'm sitting here talking about it, and I'm like mindfully holding back my tears, you know, because I'm like, okay, this shouldn't be a big deal. This shouldn't be a big deal. Suck it up. But like, because in my head, it's like, this really isn't like, no one like hurt me physically. Everything was fine. Like, this isn't a world-shattering issue, but it hits my core value, and it is. Like, it's painful because it directly hits that issue.
Yes.
Or that purpose or whatever the things he was talking about.
Those types of things that generally we think are, well, it's justifiable that you're messed up or that you hurt or whatever because some horrible abuse happened to you, some awful injustice happened to you, all those kind of things may be easier to get over than something that hits that core place, though, you know, that resonates and then shows up over. My experience is those are the things, those are the whack-a-moles. Those are the things that have shown up over and over and over again in my life that have added insult to injury. But then I'm like, wow, what right do I have to be messed up or grieve over this? But it is because it's hitting at the core part of who God created us to be.
Before we get off, I feel like I need to hit one other point, and that's healing then doesn't come from a universal approach. Healing actually comes when you're able to begin to rest in who God created you to be, to where all of a sudden you're able to look with a new perspective on all of those old wounds that came all the way along, and you're able to say, oh, that's why that hurt so much. That's why that hurt so much. It was trying to declare to me that I'm a nobody and that I'm a loser, and so it was coming at me, and it was cutting at the very core of my purpose. It was cutting at the very fabric of my heart. If all of a sudden you can look back and see all of those events in light of that, resting in who God created you to be, that changes everything. Once somebody's able to speak into your life, or God speaks into your life in a way that wakes up that sense of purpose, it wakes up that sense of passion in you to where you're able to go, this is who I am. And you're able to get into that place and rest in it. It's when that gets awakened, it's so much easier to go back and forgive, let go of, clean up all of those old things. But what so many people do, they don't understand the part of me right here, right now, needing to be validated. So they deal with wound. Okay, I should be fixed now. No, you still don't even know who you are. You can't rest in who you are. So the next wound is just waiting to happen tomorrow. In fact, today, before you even get out of the studio. It's coming at you again. Why? Because you haven't gotten to that point of being able to rest in Christ. When you get there, that's where the deep healing really begins to come in. And this is what's true, and this is what works. And we try to address it from a mental illness standpoint of, would you just change your thinking here? Well, if you don't get that core message from God, that core message from godly people around you who speak into you and say, this is who God created you to be. And it comes in such a powerful way that you're able to go, wow. Mm-hmm. That seeing you and speaking to you, that's transformational. That's what we need. And we're addressing mental illness.
Right.
It just, the model is weak compared to when you have a spirit-centered model that understands who we are in Christ and what our spiritual man is and the power that our spiritual man actually holds. Okay. One of you want to say something, or do I close it out here?
I think we better wrap it up because I didn't put on waterproof mascara, and if you keep going, I am going to cry.
Well, thank you for joining us. I do think some of the ideas that have been presented here are going to test you, stretch you, and challenge you. And I encourage you, number one, go back, listen to it again, think about it, pray about it, check the scriptures, see if we're biblical. If you don't like what you see or hear, throw questions. I love it. Bring them on, okay? So challenge it, bring it however you want to bring it. But in addition to that, I believe you know people who can be blessed by this, and it will actually give them hope because they've been living inside of a model that hasn't helped them. So pass it on to people who need some real help. They need some hope. They need to get a hold of something. Subscribe, pass it on, help us, help you equip other people to change lives. Thank you for joining us.